What is the value of this dollar? No, this isn't some sort of philosophical video saying it has no value. It definitely does. You know, you can buy things with it. You can even buy other currencies with this, but no one seems to know for sure how much of this dollar can buy this euro. One day it's
0.9143.
Another it's
0.8237.
The next it's
1.0267.
What is it? The value changes every day. More realistically, it actually changes every minute of every day as different currencies are bought and sold on the foreign exchange market. But what if you could keep the money at a certain dollar price all the time? Wouldn't that make it a lot easier to do business in a foreign country? Luckily, governments can do this. They call it pegging a currency to another. The Balboa is pegged to the US dollar, the CFA franc is pegged to the euro, and, well, nobody pegs to that anymore. Are there any benefits to this? Let's look at 3 areas of the world to find out. Starting with China. From 1994 to 2005, China kept its exchange rate at around 8.28 yuan for every dollar. That's not exactly valueless, but this makes a less flashy title. Then they stopped the peg in 2005, but don't think the exchange rate is free floating nowadays. Every morning, the People's Bank of China fixes a daily reference rate around the dollar and allows the yuan to float within 2% of that range. Almost the same thing as pegging it. So by the early 2020s, it's more like 6 to 7 yuan for every dollar. Why would they do this to their people? Doesn't it make the yuan buy less? Simple. Yes, it does. But the less a currency is worth, the cheaper the products are. You cannot look around your house without finding a Made in China label. They're the world's largest manufacturer and largest exporter in part thanks to this cheap money strategy. The same strategy that both Japan and Germany used to boost their exports after they were destroyed from the war. But there are some problems with this. First, people don't like it. Americans don't like it in particular. This president, this Secretary of State, and this Fed chairman have all called China a currency manipulator. Labeling them as such has been official US policy since 2019. They're basically saying China is forcing them to be too dependent on their relationship, but instead of gaslighting the Americans, they make cheap iPhones. On the one hand, yeah, purposefully keeping your money cheap to manufacture more goods can be seen as taking jobs from other parts of the world. But hey, on the other hand, keeping these products cheap has kept prices down for decades, benefiting everyone who buys from China. Second problem, it's not very, free? Yes, it keeps exports cheap, but usually little mom and pop stands don't make enough products to ship overseas. Exporters are almost always massive conglomerates, especially in China with their tight government-business relationship. China has plenty of both outright state-owned manufacturing companies and special management shares in some of the largest privately owned companies to give them sway in investments and operations. Don't get me wrong, China still gets an overall bonus from this strategy, and the average Chinese worker saw their standard of living increase significantly after the 80s, but they also could have seen their working hours grow and their country get more unequal. Third problem, maintaining the peg requires the central bank to buy or sell foreign assets whenever the value of the yuan gets too high or too low. All you need to know about this is that China buys up a lot of foreign exchange reserves, from about $200 billion in 2000 to over $3 trillion of them now, with about 1/3 of that being US government debt. So, throughout their industrialization process to keep their money cheap, the relatively poor China transferred over $1 trillion to the rich United States, directly funding whatever goes on in their government. Another way to keep the money cheap? Print a lot of it. Since 2000, China has increased their money supply by how much? 3 times? No. 5 times? No. By 15 times. For context, the USA has increased its dollar supply by around 4 times in the same time. And you see how many Americans want to go back to the gold standard after that. Because of this, banks in China have been required to hold large reserves of yuan, effectively removing it from circulation and removing much of the bank's potential profits with it, a system that only really works with close government business ties and outright state-owned banks. But in exchange for these problems, China does get stability and confidence in its exchange rate and exports, something you shouldn't just take for granted. Investor confidence can turn ports from this into this. Bustling. China's peg was in the past. What about now, though? Who still has currency pegs in the modern day? Well, most nations which peg to only one other currency are small countries trying to integrate into a larger market. Lesotho and Eswatini with the South African rand, Nepal and Bhutan to the rupee, Bulgaria and Bosnia with the euro, and pretty much all of these tiny islands with the US dollar. Oh, and Cuba too. But one region stands out for being the land of currency pegs. Arabia, with 7 countries pegged to the US dollar. 3 of these countries, Jordan, Oman, and Bahrain, choose a rate more valuable than the US dollar, making imports relatively cheap. Another 3 of these countries, Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, choose a rate less valuable than the dollar, making exports relatively cheap. Can you guess which export that might be? Doing this allows them to stack up reserves and make a de facto sovereign wealth fund. Although that's not to say they don't have actual sovereign wealth funds, they definitely do. In fact, give them a round of applause. They're all in the world's largest 10. The Gulf strategy is not what's important in this video, but at the center of it is 2 things: digging up hydrocarbons and shipping them off on boats, and saving that money to invest in their economies and worldwide. Doesn't hurt that they also do crazy rich things like build the world's tallest towers, linear cities, host World Cups, and buy Ronaldo. But what's really kept this strategy alive for so long is exporting energy. And by consistently expressing their commitment to keeping the exchange rate low, they can keep confidence high and that sweet investor money rolling in. Though, out of these 7 pegged countries, there's one that stands out. Look, all normal exchange rate, and then there's Lebanon with 15,000 Lebanese pounds to 1 US dollar. That's what the government has committed to holding? Why on earth would they do that? Short answer is, it's actually worth even less. This is an overvaluation of the Lebanese pound. In the parallel market, that is to say, them streets, 1 US dollar could trade for 100,000 pounds in early 2023, not even to say what it could trade for now. Lebanon is a state with no way to back up its peg. It's basically a ghost exchange rate. After getting hit with a triple economic political crisis of defaulting on their debt, COVID, and the Beirut explosion all in 2020, the government has been in political deadlock and confidence was lost in their economy. With a collapsing currency, people rushed to convert their pounds into dollars, leading to a bank meltdown and a financial ruin of around $70 billion. Everything from imports to government services has shut down as they've either become too expensive to buy or run. Some stores and markets have even started pricing in dollars instead of pounds as a safe refuge, a de facto dollarization of the economy. So if you have access to dollars in Lebanon, you can live large, but unfortunately, 90% of the population is still paid in pounds, meaning a median salary in 2023 is only worth about $300 under this black market exchange rate. A currency peg will not fix Lebanon. It'll almost certainly be devalued, abandoned, or the entire currency abandoned as people look for another safe store of value in a time of economic crisis. Yeesh, 15,000? What if instead of keeping our currency undervalued, we just keep it at the exact same level as the dollar? Let's go to Argentina to find out how this went. Spoiler, it didn't go well. Under this guy, the 1990s president of Argentina, Carlos Menem, the country set up a currency board to keep the value of the newly formed peso at 1 US dollar, that is, not one of their old currency, which was worth a 10,000th of a peso now. There were 2 main motives for this. One is that Mr. Carlos wanted to boost up Argentina's place in the world by removing trade and financial barriers, and part of that plan was to set up this currency board so foreign investors wouldn't get spooked about the fluctuating value of the peso. But maybe they were scared because of the second reason though. Look at Argentina's inflation graph, sometimes high, sometimes low, then BAM! In the late 80s it got insane, an average of 2,600% inflation in 1989 and 1990, practically collapsing banking and trust in the country. So in 1991, the convertibility plan was put in place, 1-for-1 peso with the USD. That's this graph in theory, and it worked. To keep prices down at least. Between 1992 and 1998, inflation came to only 4.6% on average. Good thing too, because the ending of the story isn't so nice. There were some pretty big problems with this plan. One is that high on investor confidence, the government overspent and overborrowed from the rest of the world. Argentina had 1, 2, 3. 4 financing arrangements with the IMF throughout the 90s. This was a period of low government debt, and they still used IMF funding for all the spending they were doing. That's how confident they were. 2. The dollar's value rose in the late 90s, putting pressure on Argentina to maintain the peg. This made their products more expensive and hurt them as they were a net exporter at the time. And third problem, investors. Normally, to maintain this currency peg, you need a huge pile of international reserves to sell in case your currency starts losing value. But Argentina required that the central bank only needed to hold 66.6% of the peso supply in dollar reserves. This meant that if everyone in the country suddenly wanted to convert their pesos into dollars, there might only be $2 for every 3 pesos. Would you invest in a country who couldn't reliably keep their currency's value? So, there were swings of speculation, rich people in Manhattan offices saying, "No, trust me, this time the peso definitely crashes." Many of these swings were after other currencies had crashed. Mexico's in 1994, currencies across Asia in 1997, Russia's in 1998, and Brazil's in 1999. That very same year, the government changed, and these structural problems started to cause a stagnation. Stagnation then turned into a recession, and international investors pulled out en masse. About $20 billion of foreign money in 2001 alone. The government tried what it could do to stop this. It raised income taxes, it raised financial transaction taxes, but it didn't work. Money kept flowing out, businesses left, people were left unemployed, and tried to take their savings out of pesos to convert them into dollars if they could, leading to a government freeze of bank accounts. Then, in December 2001, the new government announced it couldn't pay back their $94 billion debt and entered the second largest default in history, partly because of fears the peso would crash in value. In the end, the fears became true. The country ended up abandoning the peg and let the peso crash and keep coming down for what has now been the past 2 decades. As a result of not keeping good care of this peg, the country ended up with a worthless currency and permanent damage to their credibility. So make sure you can actually back it up if you choose to peg your currency.